So, we can go anywhere at this point. I'm sorry. I just wanted to kind of
Well,
generalize the overall thought here, but there's lots of little neat things in here, especially the time for this and the time for that. There's a lot of little interesting cadences that he uses when he describes these seven sets or these 14 little poetic statements. Um, but yeah, there's a lot here. So go ahead. Anybody jump in wherever they want in terms of statements or questions or comments.
well, the time to mourn connects with blessed are the mourn, for they shall be comforted. And I think elsewhere, Solomon says that it's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting.
Yes.
Right. But you'll notice in the feast, remember he's talked about eating and drinking. And we mentioned before, for those who weren't with us, verse 13, that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good. So the idea is that there's seasons or feasts, and some of the seasons or feasts are seasons of mourning or sorrow, like the Day of Atonement. The other feasts are feasts of joy, like the Feast of Tabernacles. And so the idea is there's a time for sorrow and mourning, and there's also a time for dancing. I know Adventists don't like that, but that's tough. There's time for joy and there's time for dancing, right? And so when we get to heaven and we go through the marriage feast, we'll be dancing, yeah, and we'll be enjoying. There'll be joy, right? So right now we experience the Day of Atonement, and there's the sorrow, and there's fasting, and there's searching of heart. But so that's what Solomon's saying, that there's appointed times for these things, and we're not to. The idea is that one isn't right and one isn't righteous and one evil. That's what I'm saying. That there's a time for each of these events, right? And of course, because we're under sin, we look at these events that he described in terms of the process of sin, of course. But Solomon's also going to say that a person that's not born is better off than someone who's lived 1,000 years twice over, right? But we're not advocating abortion by saying that. We're just saying that a person that hasn't been born hasn't seen the grief and pain and sorrow of this world, is what it's actually saying. But there is a time to be born and there's a time to die, right? And that's part of the cycle of that he described in terms of Ecclesiastes chapter 1. So yeah, there's a lot of neat things in here. There's a time to scatter and there's a time to gather. That's interesting. Mrs. White makes reference to those statements. She talks about people that are scattering during the gathering time. And many times we don't catch the bigger picture of what's going on. We actually start working in opposition to what's actually happening. So
Well, we see in the story of Nebuchadnezzar that there's a 7 times scattering, but at the end of that, there's a promise of a time of gathering. And
that's right.
She actually referred to that time in her day after 1840. That leading up to 1844 was a time of scattering, but then the time had come for the gathering, for the restoration of the kingdom.
That's right. And those times, the time, we keep using Nebuchadnezzar 4, that's fine. The times are significant because it's the process of the 7 times for Nebuchadnezzar that awakens him to see his need for God. Yeah. That's at the end of the 7 times, he lifts his eyes to heaven and he realizes his need for God.
That was the purpose. He realizes
right. That's the whole purpose. And so the point is that one isn't evil and one righteous. No, it's the time is describing a process, and each step of the process, you can't skip the step of the process or the end result will not be what it's supposed to be. Yeah. That's what's so critical. And so go ahead.
I mean, just to press on that point, the time is describing a process, but the process is connected to a specific time.
That's right.
It's connected to a time connected to the number 7. And, it's just very curious to me that I mean, this whole passage that we're reading is about repeating patterns. That which is being is that which shall be. And the whole passage is also about time, verses 1 through 8 and verse 15. And specifically in verse 16, it's about the time of judgment. And we have this idea that at the beginning of the judgment, there was a specific time that was very significant. But somehow at the end of the time of judgment, when the judgment of the living comes, this time doesn't matter anymore. There's all these repeating patterns, and we say the patterns are repeating, but we say the time doesn't repeat. But I think that's actually directly contradicting what Solomon is telling us here. He said there's a time for everything. That means there's a time for the judgment of the living. It's a specific time, and it's going to happen in a time frame that God is in control of. You know, God didn't reveal it in advance, yes, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a time set for these things.
That's right. And we focused on verse 11. The end of verse 11 talks about God works or creates asaz from the beginning to the end.
That's right.
So just as the beginning was a set time, creation in the beginning,
7 days.
Genesis, so the book of Revelation also deals with a set time.
Yeah.
Right. So the point is that we, again, we're talking about in the context of creation, but when you begin to understand creation, Genesis, then you begin to understand Revelation at the end, because the end mirrors the beginning, and it's a circle. It's a cyclical thinking. Is
That's
what
right.
describing.
Exactly. But it's just strange to me that we
that's why
take the very passage that gives us the principle that the patterns are repeating, and then we say the patterns are repeating except the time, when the passage itself is about time and it's how it repeats.
Well, and see, these are some of the things, just like I talked about, the whole idea of the mark of the beast principle, that we have made too specific to one event rather than seeing it as a principle.
Yeah.
It's the same idea, is that our view of the end is so narrow because we have put all these blinders on that blind us to what the Bible actually says about the end. And so that's why we don't see the big picture, right? That's part of what we're struggling with. That's why we're reading the Bible, and we see in Ecclesiastes that Solomon has his eyes wide open, and he's telling us that if you understand the end, you need to study the beginning. If you understand the beginning, then you have to study the end, because the two mirror each other. Absolutely.
And it is because of in Revelation 10, when it says there'll be time no longer, that there's no more prophetic time, stretching according to the year-day principle past 1844, but literal time didn't end, and so I think Satan has tempted us to extend the principle farther and just get rid of all idea of understanding the time. And I know many people that do that.
Right. Well, this is why as you have heard me teach, I stress the eternal gospel and the process of the eternal gospel. And in there, you have to talk about time, but the point is that if you deal with the principle of the eternal gospel, and people begin to see, if you see the first angel's message, there has to be the second and third and the fourth. The whole process has to be there. And when you begin to realize that it's the eternal gospel, that it's not something that happened in the past and then it's done, it's something that recurs, then that's supposed to open up our mind to many other avenues of light that God can begin to shine to us about the things that he wants to explain about the end. And that's what I believe God is desperately trying to do. And we just think we're waiting for Jesus to come or something. I don't know where we've been for so long, but anyway.
When we learn about times and seasons, we're also like using our 4 seasons, the summer, winter, summers, all that. There were the sons of Issachar, and they understood the times and they knew what to do. I can't remember what book that's in, but the sun is,
First Chronicles chapter 12.
thank you. Yep. And I think what he's trying to help us do is to understand the season, because Jesus talked about the fig tree, when you see the leaves, you know the fruit's coming. And we're learning to recognize the leaves for what they are.
Right. And by the way, all that imagery is kingship imagery. And in Daniel, when he talks about the times and seasons, he's literally in Daniel chapter 2, he's talking about the kings.
Yes.
So the time and season is based on who is the king, and who the king is, whether he's a king of righteousness or a king of evil, governs the time and season. And so the idea of times and seasons, just like the idea of a fig tree, all that stuff is kingly imagery, is kingship imagery. And that's what, of course, we talked about that, about Ecclesiastes. He introduces himself as the king. Of course, he's not only the king, the standard of righteousness by which everybody is measured, but he's also the one who calls everybody out of their Egypt or out of their chaos to come into the wilderness to grow. And he's also the one who comes alongside, the paracol, who teaches. So he's the teacher. So Ecclesiastes, he's the king. He's the one who makes the call. That's the ambassador. He's also the one who comes alongside and teaches. He's the teacher. So this king in Ecclesiastes is all three of those things. But that's the idea in the ancient mind. The king and the time and season is connected to the king. Yes. Because he determines the time and the season. And you'll see throughout the book of Daniel, for example, it'll say the first year of, or the third year of, and it'll talk about a king and what year of his reign. And then the story happens in the context of that year of the reign of that king. That's the time and the season.
Yes.
It's very interesting that in Isaiah, he says that we're to be a watchman upon the walls, and that we know in Isaiah 21 that the watchman declares what he sees regarding the king coming. And we think about time as beginning and end. We cut it off. Time has no beginning and ending with the Holy One. He is in the past, he is in the present, he is in the future. We're to be watchmen among the walls in our time to see who he is and what he consists of. But we always want to measure time or somehow put it into blocks, and it can't be done. That's a very linear thinking. And God, I don't believe he thinks that way in terms of time. He's actually in the past right now. He's in the present, and he's in the future. And we are passing through time. We can't use it up. We can't consume time. It just is. It is who he is.
Well, where he said that there's a time for every purpose. If the first verse, it says that for everything there's a season and a time. A season is a broader scope of chunk of time. It's and then a time is more specific in that sentence, but also for every purpose. You look at a time to be born. We understand that when someone is pregnant, that it is the season has come where we can expect a child in a certain amount of time. And so we make our preparations with the understanding that there's a child to be born, and we need to make preparations in the home. The relatives make preparations to welcome a new little child or whatever, and see how we can all help with that. And like with a season for planting, there's a time to plant and a time to pluck up what was planted. We understand the time to plant, when the oak leaves are the size of a mouse's ear, it's time to plant the corn. When the potato plants have died back, it's time to harvest those. When we know that there's a time, it's a more specific, smaller window of what we call time. But the season, we're learning to recognize the season. And like Pastor, you talk about the kingdom. We're learning the kingdom vocabulary and mindset. Yes. And this is one of the things. And then in Mark chapter 1, the first few verses, you prepare the way of the Lord. Prepare ye the way of the Lord. Make his path straight. And behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which is you, singular. God sent his messenger before each one of our faces to prepare our ways before us so that we can make the Lord's path straight for those who are around us. But the time and the seasons, this is really incredible, because the season thing is more general, so we can prepare for the time. And when we don't want to be those who will say, well, the harvest is past. We want to be part of that. But anyway.
And to add what you're saying, Sue, in Mark 1, then Jesus comes along and says, the time is fulfilled. The kingdom of heaven is at hand.
Yes.
Right? So yes. And so what I would say, to go back to what both of you are saying, is that God is above all, through all, and in all. God isn't measured by time, but Jesus steps into time. And so these are the times and seasons when Jesus actually stepped off the throne of the universe as God and became a creature to save humanity. That's a time and season, right? The time and season when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, it literally became a man instead of the angel of God that of the Old Testament that we see. He actually becomes a man in Bethlehem. That's a time and season, right? And then, of course, his death and resurrection. Then he goes to heaven. Now he's the priest in the heavenly sanctuary. That's a time and season. And the event that we're awaiting, the restoration of all things to rightness, is the restoration of him who is the creator of all things in rightness to his rightful place. So when he's restored to his kingly throne of the universe, that's a new time and season. And we say new to us, but it is new. It's new to all creation because something has happened to the creator. The same thing when Jesus dies on the cross. What do you think the angels felt when they saw their creator dying on a cross? I mean, these are times and seasons. These are events that the God that's above all time actually makes himself subject to time and space. So these are part of the mysteries. So the idea of the time and seasons that we're talking about is so directly connected to kingship and kingdom dynamics, because it's the king himself, the creator of all life. Though the things that happen to him is what determines the time and the season. He determines time and season, not us.
I really like that prophecy on Issachar that the sister brought up about understanding of the times, because one of the tribes of the 144,000 is the tribe of Issachar. So God is going to have people at the end of time who have understanding of the times.
Right. And when you say at the end of time, they have an understanding of the time. Well, that's the whole point. They understand that it is the end of time.
Yes.
Well, at the end of what time?
But they also understand the principles that we're talking about, and they understand the beginning that the end is bringing us back to, and all of it. Right. And they can explain that to people.
So in other words, these things have been thought through. So when we say the end of time, we're saying the end of the reign of sin in time, right?
And to connect it to the king, they have understanding of the time.
That's right.
They stand under the dominion of the king, so they understand the time.
So they know the Lord of time.
Yes.
So they have the understanding. See what's so cool is that it just begins to open up all these avenues.
Yes.
Which so much light can start shining. That's the beauty of it.
Yes.
That's what I see Solomon trying to get us to do. That's what I see Solomon wrestling to do.
They know the wonderful number, as Daniel calls him in Daniel 8.
Yeah. And won't it be cool to sit there with God, sit there with Christ, and go over these passages that you've wrestled with your whole life, and you see all this brilliant truth come out of these texts, and then all of a sudden Christ will speak and show you volumes of things that you have never even imagined could be in the text, and you'll just sit there in awe, right, of the light and the truth that just shines from the living Word.
Amen.
Yeah. Whatsoever God does, it is eternal, and nothing can be added to it, and nothing can be taken from it. That's just an awesome statement.
Yeah. That men should fear before him.
That's right. The first angel's message, the eternal gospel.
Be in awe.
Yeah, I like the one to embrace. I guess because I like the book of Habakkuk, but that Habakkuk, his name means to embrace. There's a time to Habakkuk, and there's a time to refrain from Habakkuk. That's like there's a lot of neat things in his phrases that he uses. Yeah. Oh. So I've showed you 4, 5, 7s in chapter 3. I think it's neat that Solomon keeps using the 7s as a symbol of God's perfection, God's completion, God's eternality, to describe or challenge us to see God, who he is, and to see ourselves and our finiteness in light of who God is.
It's the completion of the cycle. It's a complete cycle that brings you back to perfection.
Right.
Beginning. The path that he requires. And in the midst of the pattern of 7 is the cross. That's what makes that's where the death is, but it's what makes the resurrection and restoration back to the beginning possible, is the cross in the midst of that pattern, that perfect pattern of 7.
Yeah, so I really hope that the comments that we're making will give you insights to go back and again, I would encourage you to try to read chunks of the book of Ecclesiastes with some of the thoughts that God gives you in mind, and then what will happen is it'll start opening other passages of Ecclesiastes that you hadn't perhaps seen in that perspective before, and it'll actually shine a lot more light. And when you be sensitive to the repetition. So, for example, I told you that the word kol, or every or all, is used 7 times between verses 17 and verse 20. Well, so when you start seeing these repetitions, then you realize that there's a principle, there's a pattern that Solomon is portraying through the words, and then it causes us to slow down and pay attention. Let's close with prayer, and then we'll let people go. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you and we praise you that everything has its appointed time, and that you brought us into existence, that you knew our days before we lived them, that all of our days were written in a book. Psalm 139 tells us that you knew our days, you brought us into existence for this time, and that you want us to see you, to know you through the events of our life, to see our great need for you, to see that you are the only source of good, that all life and good and joy and happiness and righteousness and peace comes only from you, and that we give up our vain and futile ways of trying to make our life worth something or have value apart from you. And that may we walk with you and talk with you, and then invite others to have the same joyous experience of knowing you for themselves. We just thank you and praise you for your word. And we ask that your word would come to life in us, in Jesus' name.